A few days ago, ContraPoints released a new video titled The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. As a fan of hers, and a fellow trans creator who made a video about the world's most famous transphobe a few months ago, I was excited to check it out. I enjoyed ContraPoint's video. The Anita Bryant / J.K. Rowling comparison was apt. Her distillation of the gender-critical movement's motivations on the money. And her conclusion was profound. But that's not why you're here. You're here because, as my title and thumbnail claim, I disagree with her. She makes two claims in the video I take umbrage with. So let's dive into what they are and stir the wonderfully algorithmic pot of drama. Halfway through the video, ContraPoints discusses debate. While disassembling the right's misappropriation of the concept to legitimize their hate, she makes clear she's not opposed to the idea of debate, and points to a facet of trans women in sports as an area she'd be willing to have an honest debate about. ContraPoints says,
but if we're talking about professional weightlifting, well, then it seems plausible that trans women who have been through male puberty may still retain some kind of group advantage.
The premise here is that perhaps we should have a debate on how and where we allow trans women to compete in professional weightlifting. ContraPoints doesn't take a side on this, she just says it's a debate she'd be willing to have. I don't have a problem with ContraPoints' point, because I do not know enough about sports science or endocrinology to speak on the matter, which, note, neither does any conservative making claims about the topic. So, then why do I disagree? Well, because it frames issues around trans women in sports around advantages, which forces us to debate conservatives and transphobes on their terms. Another YouTuber, Jessie Gender, tweeted a similar opinion, writing, "The issue is not who has advantages, the issue is why we segregate sports by men and women in general." So, at least I'm not alone in this criticism. The core emotional anchor transphobes latch onto to fuel their hate of trans people regarding our inclusion in women's sports is integrity, competitive integrity. They believe that if we're allowed to compete, it undermines the spirit of competitive fairness. I do not want to argue with them on that front, because it tacitly concedes to them that if trans women's inclusion can be proven to be competitively unfair, we should be excluded. Instead, I prefer to point out that the purpose of sports is not competitive fairness. In the real world, away from dishonest arguments to spread hate about marginalized groups, the entire concept of competitive integrity in sports is only important to like two groups. Gambling institutions who need strict competitive rules so competitors don't rig matches and undermine their service, and audiences who want to watch exciting and suspenseful sporting events. Audiences want to feel like the event of a sporting match is contingent on the live and spontaneous actions of the competitors, not backroom deals or whatever. In order to draw and keep audiences, sports teams and leagues enforce codes of conduct, primarily to maintain the illusion of fair competition. For everyone else, competitive fairness is rarely, if ever, obtained. For instance, let's consider my former high school, which played a whole season of boys varsity football in 2022. The team played 10 games and went 5-5, or 5 wins and 5 losses. On the face of it, that looks pretty fair. They won exactly half their games. But if we look at the scores, that's not good. The closest margin of victory across all 10 games was 18 points, which is a 3-score game. That's not close. In 3 games, a team failed to score at all, and the average score difference across all 10 games was an astounding 32.8 points. That's absurd. None of these games were competitively fair. So, if that was the point of sports, why bother with adolescent athletics at all? Because they offer the participants more than just the opportunity to win in a competitive environment. Sports allow individuals to be part of something bigger than themselves, to gain new skills and confidence in themselves, and to have social relationships based around common goals. all important parts of development. For instance, when I was in 8th grade, I competed in track and field. Primarily, I did the long jump and some of the sprints, and I think I also did the triple jump now that I think about it. I was terrible. The only reason I didn't place last in every single event was because sometimes other competitors didn't show up and were disqualified. But let's be clear, in every race I ever ran, I was the last person to cross the finish line. Despite my physical ineptitude, I always tried my best, but what was the point? Well, here's a story to explain why, nearly 20 years removed from competing in track, I still consider it an important activity from my childhood. One overcast day in the spring of 2006, I competed in a track meet. One of the other children meant to race that day was sick, so a coach came to me and asked if I would run the 800 meter. I was already awful at sprints, but at least they were over quickly, so I never fell too far behind. Longer distances, meanwhile, were a big no-no for me. I actually had never even run the 800 in practice. I'd run the mile a few times, but never the 800. Still, I said yes. I didn't want to disappoint my coach. It went as well as you might expect. Right out of the gate, I fell behind all the other competitors, and by the time I was maybe a third of the way through the second lap, everyone else had finished the race. So I was literally the only person on the track. As I rounded the final bend, I was embarrassed. My face was flush with emotion. I wanted to give up, but I didn't. Instead, I charged forward. I abandoned my pitiful jog and picked up pace to the fastest sprint my tired body could manage. As I did so, the crowd took pity on me and cheered. Some other child might have enjoyed that attention, but I just felt ashamed of how poorly I did. My heart was pounding, my legs were in significant pain, and I was breathing heavy, so I went to relax off the track as another race started. I was near two coaches, one of whom I admired quite a bit. I don't remember his name, so let's just call him Jeff. The two coaches talked about one of the other girls running for our school, who handily won her race. The other coach commented on how talented the student was, but Jeff responded by saying she's good, but she doesn't run with passion. Now, Evelyn, she runs with heart. I literally cannot recall a kinder comment ever said about me during my childhood. It solidified in my mind an idea about myself. I am not the most talented person. I am not the hardest worker, and I will probably lose whenever I try. But regardless of those facts, I am a person who does everything with passion, zeal, and of course, heart. That one comment is why I don't regret track and field, despite the misery of always losing and how awful it made my frail little body feel. Because in the pursuit of competition, I learned something about myself that I've never let go of. That's why sports matter. And that's what you rip away from trans youth when you deny them the opportunity to compete in sports. I simply do not care about competitive fairness. I do not care if your cis daughter loses to a trans girl, because the point of sports is not to win. I do not care if having a trans girl on a high school soccer team feels a little weird for some girls because of changing rooms, because that's got nothing to do with the reason they compete in the first place. I just don't care. If a professional organization doesn't want to include trans people, that's not a political debate. Legislatures aren't making decisions about whether or not trans athletes can compete in professional weightlifting. So I'm not going to argue with you on the merits of competitive fairness at all, because doing so cedes that is the purpose of sports in the first place. So that's why, when ContraPoints kept the focus on advantages in an aside about sports in our discussion of debate, I felt a twinge of disagreement well up within me. Do I hate her for it? No. But that's why I disagree with her. The other area of disagreement I have with ContraPoints comes a few minutes before the aside on trans sports. After describing the de-radicalization of Megan Phelps Roper, she claims that the experience of de-radicalization is more akin to religious conversion than logical reasoning. It's an interesting claim for me to examine because I'm coming at it from the opposite perspective as ContraPoints. She's spent a long time de-radicalizing people, and I spent a significant portion of my life religiously converting people. Yep, that's right. I doubt you saw that one coming. I was a missionary for a while. Yes, I know, yuck, ew, wow, oh my gosh, etc., etc. I want to tell you I regret my time in that profession, but considering I'm in an eternal internal battle between regretting everything I've ever done and trying not to do that, I won't bother. Instead, I'll remind you that I'm not the same person as I was then. Still, I was pretty good at my job, so I've seen up close what religious conversion looks like. I understand why people religiously convert. I disagree with ContraPoints because the process of de-radicalization and religious conversion seem to have separate causes, at least in my experience. De-radicalization is the process of removing oneself from an extremist group and their system of belief. Most people who de-radicalize do so because they see the flaws in the leaders of their movement. Usually, they no longer believe these leaders or ideas serve their best interest. Most of the time, I see people de-radicalize in part because they believe their radical beliefs will cause them harm, either physically, emotionally, or professionally. That's a logical action to take, even if it's backed up by emotional experiences. Much of the time, de-radicalized people still hold a lot of the same beliefs they had while radicalized. They are just no longer activating on those beliefs or are part of a community which centers them, which mutes how apparent they are on the surface. For instance, some de-radicalized homophobes I've read of seem to hold homophobic beliefs still. Those beliefs are just no longer part of that individual's core identity. My point here is simple. De-radicalization is less about conversion to a new set of beliefs, and instead a slowly backing away from how centered those beliefs are to a person's sense of self. They may someday completely renounce their former beliefs, but the road to that moment begins as an act of self-preservation much of the time. Religious conversion, meanwhile, almost always requires a leap of faith. One must accept a new system of belief to some degree without fully reckoning what it all means, because it's impossible to understand what it all means, even years after religious conversion. At some point, the would-be convert needs to make a decision. I am a Christian, or I am a Muslim now. The concept of a leap of faith comes from the fact that once you make that jump, you fall. The gravity of the decision starts to affect your life and cause changes consummate with the religion you've devoted yourself to. A religious convert sees their purpose in life in a whole new light, shaded by the new system of belief they now adhere to. I agree with ContraPoints that religious conversion often lacks a logical or reasoned out debate or conversation, and usually more of an emotionally driven kind of feeling. But rarely is the authentic convert one who acts in self-preservation like the de-radicalized individual, and instead acts out of a sense of hope that the new system of belief will change their life for the better. So yeah, I disagree with ContraPoints again. At this point though, you might realize something. These are pretty silly disagreements. I'm mostly just mincing word choices that she really didn't need to deeply consider to make her video. Both of the comments I criticize are just random asides. They aren't core to her argument in the video, and oh my gosh, they aren't even core beliefs I have. So what's the point? Why take you on this journey? Well, because I see people elevate such disagreements to existential levels all the time, particularly on the internet. It's obnoxious and annoying. It pushes well-meaning people out of spaces and forces them to disengage with their own communities. So I thought it might be helpful to give y'all a new framework for thinking about what you believe. Ironically, the tool I'm going to use for teaching you comes from my time as a missionary. You see, I worked with an organization called formerly, pretty gross name. is a parachurch organization, which focuses on college campuses and converting college students. So its members come from a variety of Christian backgrounds. For it's particularly important to communicate to members that they are not a church. The organization is not a replacement for a church. They don't have doctrines like a church. They don't baptize people like a church, take communion like a church, and they don't ordain anybody. Because the moment they did any of these things, they may find themselves in conflict with their members and the churches who financially support them. Still, not being a church has its disadvantages. They are still a religious organization with some amount of orthodoxy as to what that religious belief entails. So they need a way to both retain some doctrinal beliefs while remaining open to as many different Christian perspectives as possible. To accomplish this, they adhere to a tiered system of beliefs communicated via an onion-layered chart reading convictions, persuasions, and opinions. Convictions are what we might describe as core beliefs. These are beliefs that every member of the organization must hold. We can find them in most Christian creeds. God created the world. Jesus died for our sins and was raised from the dead. The Bible is the Word of God. Or that the Holy Spirit is vibing in all the believers. Most theologians would draw the line here and say that those who stray from these beliefs aren't Christians at all. Meanwhile, persuasions are beliefs that an individual might hold fervently, but can disagree with someone and still remain in some amount of religious community with them, because these passionately held beliefs are not, at least in Christian terms, crucial to salvation. A common area of persuasive disagreement in Christian circles is around infant baptism. Some people believe a person must profess faith in order to be baptized, which an infant, for instance, cannot do. Others may view baptism as more of a ritual, something a child can partake in if their family permits. Let me tell you, some folks froth at the mouth discussing this issue, but ultimately, they usually have to admit that it does not determine whether or not you are a Christian. Finally, we have opinions, which are beliefs an individual may prefer, but have little impact on their community with others. These might include how much they like Christian rock, or want it at their church, or whether they read the King James Bible or the English Standard Version. Opinions are often aesthetic beliefs that some might hold passionately, but have little to do with the ins and outs of meaningfully practicing their faith. You must be screaming at your computer screen. Why are you telling me about the stupid belief system of a transphobic and homophobic and mildly racist parachurch organization? Well, because it's relevant to the ways we engage with each other about our belief systems around various political issues. For instance, let's take discussions of trans rights. While I'm pretty low on the visibility spectrum, I move with the crowd of transgender activists. After all, I am a transgender person who has made videos about my trans experience and have argued on this channel for trans rights. While we should never have one arbiter of what it means to be a believer in trans rights, I want to give you an idea of how we could apply the tiered onion of convictions, persuasions, and opinions to our political project. Convictions we might have are statements like trans men are men, trans women are women, trans people should have access to gender-affirming care, or trans people should be able to go to the bathroom that matches their gender. I could list more, but hopefully you get the point. If someone doesn't hold these beliefs, I don't think they're a trans activist, ally, or believer in trans rights at all. Persuasions, meanwhile, are beliefs we might disagree fervently about, but still concede that the person we disagree with still believes in trans rights. For instance, Vosh believes it's fine to be misogynistic toward transphobes like J.K. Rowling. I do not think misogyny is okay, and I think that kind of activism is moronic. Still, I must concede that no matter how much I despise that Vosh engages in bizarro misogyny to defend my rights as a trans person, the action itself does not disqualify him from believing in trans rights. I could probably talk about Vosh some more, but I don't want to get into a verbal fight about him today, so let's move on. Finally, opinions are beliefs that have little bearing on whether or not an individual is a trans activist, ally, or believer in trans rights. Both of my disagreements with ContraPoints are opinions at best, or perhaps just fringe ideas that don't matter. When we talk about trans women in professional weightlifting, it's like it doesn't really matter. To be clear, it's important to some trans people, and I sympathize with that, but whether or not trans women have an advantage in a particular sport and can compete in professional competitions put up by private organizations has little to do with my rights as a trans person. To put it another way, we could live in a world where such a private sporting body restricts the participation of trans people and still live in a world where trans people have rights granted by the government, and including most of the most important ones. As we round out this discussion, I want to remind you the original purpose of framing a system of beliefs this way: to unite people with mostly common goals, but differing ideas on some tangential issues. The problem I often see in leftist or activist spaces is members conflate these different areas of beliefs. Persuasions and opinions may be held, defended, and used to attack otherwise supporters of things like trans rights with violent rhetoric, as though they've strayed from the core convictions of the trans rights movement. One of the most pertinent examples from this year is the reaction to Hogwarts Legacy. Like, yeah, it's a stupid game. I have not played it, and I don't plan to. Harry Potter is a tainted well for me. I can't enjoy it because of J.K. Rowling's anti-trans activism. That said, boycotting a stupid video game is not a core belief or action of the trans rights movement. At best, it's a persuasion, though I personally feel like it's just an opinion. If you feel passionate about it, that's fine, but the game doesn't matter. It could sell 1 billion copies, but by itself, it does not affect my rights as a trans person at all. Yes, it does give more legitimacy and money to an awful bigot, but J.K. Rowling's success and platform are only tangentially related to my rights, even though she's a massive transphobe with a big platform. I care about this because these fringe opinions are treated as full-on convictions as they pertain to our rights, and conservative hate groups and movements are capitalizing on it and stripping us of our rights while we're debating whether or not girlfriend reviews can play a wizarding video game. I know these are not mutually held beliefs. You can fight against both at the same time, but it's the kind of action we allow ourselves to be associated with. It's the kind of thing we present to the world as important to us, as a conviction we collectively hold. It's okay to disagree with others, but the severity of that disagreement needs to be checked. We've got to stop suggesting our belief avocados are just a giant pit, a space with no room for disagreement or debate. Someone can disagree with you on Hogwarts Legacy and still be an ally, still believe in trans rights. If we accept some disagreement while retaining the truly important beliefs, we can build a stronger movement that better communicates our needs to people outside our activist circles and convinces them to get on board with stopping the Republican hate machine, because they need to be stopped before half this country has outright banned trans people from public life. Incidentally, this is pretty much the exact point ContraPoints ends her video on, so on that, we certainly agree. And that's what actually matters. I am Error, Trans Rights Forever, signing off.